Hi. MetaModule from 4MS is a portable, self-contained modular system interoperable with VCV Rack, with physical knobs and inputs and outputs, and a growing list of hundreds of virtual modules that you can use on their own or patch together to create your own synth, external effect, or built-in MetaModule. You can create patches on MetaModule itself, but it's easier to create them using VCV Rack and transfer them over using a USB drive, the SD card, or optional Wi-Fi expander. In this video, I'll explore MetaModule's ins and outs, try to stress test it to its limits, and talk about its pros and cons. Before I start, a quick disclosure: 4MS sent me MetaModule. Other than that, no money changed hands. They have no say over the content of this video and don't get to see it before it's published. Also, a shout out to Jaynothin, who makes patches over on Twitch, for sending me over some of the patches you'll hear in the intro and outro to stress test different ideas on this module. Okay, let's start with an overview. MetaModule is a single Eurorack module that lets you load up one or more of hundreds of different virtual modules. You can control those modules using the onboard knobs and patch these modules either to each other or to other modules or synths in your extended setup using the patch points on the panel. It comes with virtual modules from multiple different brands. These are just the ones available on release date, and when you dig into each of these, you'll find plenty of modules to explore within almost all the brands. So quite a few to choose from, including the almost obligatory clones of mutable instruments modules, but plenty of other unusual suspects, as you can see here. Brands that make very original and interesting modules to explore. It's also based on an open SDK, so anyone can compile modules for it without going through 4MS. There is a limit on the number of modules you can actually load up and run simultaneously. It's based on the available CPU. Simpler modules can take between 1 to 5% of the CPU, but more complex ones can take up much more. For example, you can see that with just these 3 modules, we're already hovering at a relatively high percentage rate, but I loaded up some pretty power-hungry ones. If we start up with a new patch and load maybe simple modules, you'll see that they don't take up too much CPU. I'll discuss this further later in the video. On the panel, MetaModule has 12 pot-style knobs, 6 bigger ones, and 6 smaller trim pot-style knobs. Functionality-wise, regardless of their size, all 12 are identical. By default, they're not mapped to anything. I'll show you how to map them in a bit. Each knob can also act as a macro knob to control multiple parameters in a patch. While it's a bit hard to see the knob names on the little panels, once you map these knobs, they'll appear in knob sets, which will be clearly labeled as you'll see in a bit, and you can have multiple knob sets per patch. You don't have to create these assignments though. You can always dive into a particular model, and if you want to edit a parameter, you'll also see its name clearly here. You can press it and then adjust it using the screen encoder. So this requires a bit of clicking back and forth to control different parameters, which is why you'll want to assign these knobs to parameters. Anyway, moving on, front and center is a almost 3-inch in diagonal color LCD screen. It's not OLED, but has fairly good viewing angles, and it's not a touch screen. Rather, you navigate using the main endless detent push encoder and the back button. On the bottom are 8 audio or CV outputs and 6 audio/CV inputs, as well as 2 gate inputs. MetaModule has an SD card slot and USB-C port for USB drives or to connect an external MIDI controller. You can use both the SD card and the USB drive for storing your patches and for storing modules that aren't included in the factory set, which are called plugins here. There's also a small built-in internal drive both for patches and for the factory modules. Beside the core physical module, 4MS is also planning to sell various expanders that can hook up to the back, including this Wi-Fi expander for wireless patch transfer from a computer, and various knob, button, and slider port expanders, one of which also includes a TRS MIDI input. In terms of the interface, you'll be navigating across 3 screens. This one, the one where you create patches, and the one where you see what the knob sets do. There's also a little screen you can access with this button here to show you which modules are connected to which jacks. None are currently, but we'll do that very soon. You can create entire modules on MetaModule itself, but overall it's much more fun and immediate to build complex patches on a computer. 4MS have created a virtual MetaModule for VCV Rack, which doesn't host patches. I think that would indeed be quite meta, but rather it helps you map macro controls, inputs, and outputs much faster than doing it on the module itself, so that when you transfer patches over here, you won't need to go into menus and map knobs and jacks to modules. Rather, they'll just work. More on this later as well. So that's it for the overview. Let's dive in, start a new patch, and I'll look at 2 use cases. One is where you want to use MetaModule as a kind of mega disting to emulate different modules within a larger setup without patching modules to each other here. And if that's what you want, you'll love the Automap function. So let's choose a module, for example, the 4MS ensemble oscillator. I'll load it into this patch. And rather than connect each of its components manually, I can just go into this little wrench menu, hit Automap in a new knob set. You'll see that everything that's been automapped is now color coordinated here. And if I exit this and go into the knob sets, we'll see our ensemble oscillator knob set. If I go into the jacks, we can see what's been mapped. All these inputs for CV control, these outputs for audio out. And if I patch it in, we'll hear the ensemble oscillator, and I can go ahead into the knob set and start playing with its parameters. Let's maybe start a new patch and look at a different example. We'll go to Mutable Instruments, Plats, a crowd favorite. Again, add it to the patch. Go into here, hit Automap, in new knob set. Now you may want to make some changes to the default mappings. So for example here, if we look at the jacks, we can see the volt per octave jack hasn't been mapped. It doesn't have this little color circle around it. And that's because Automap just took the first 6 inputs and mapped them to the 6 inputs here. There aren't any more CV inputs. However, we know that the strum input is kind enough to settle for just simple gate inputs. So we can go through the mapping of the parameters and the jacks, look for the trigger mapped to input 6, and then go ahead into this, disconnect this connection, and connect it to a new panel cable. And rather than input 6, we'll choose, say, gate 1, make the connection, and that freed up input 6 on the panel for us to connect the volt per octave input. So new panel cable, input 6 is the default because it's empty, that's good, hit connect. And now we've got a panel representation both for trigger and for volt per octave. And we can now hook up a gate output from Gliss into the strum input, CV output from Gliss into input 6. So let's check out what this patch sounds like. Now we can go ahead and control the module from here. Say, for example, if I wanted to turn the harmonics knob, I could go into here, hit adjust, and then change the harmonics, or go into any other parameter, timbre, let's say. But Automap has also been kind enough to map the knobs. So if we go into the Automap screen, you can see everything's been named right here for us. So for example, knob D is harmonics, E is timbre, F is morph. So using this is obviously much more immediate than diving into the menus here. If we wanted, we could go ahead and keep adding modules. Let's go for, say, random maker, which is marbles, and then go into this and auto map it in a new knob set. Now you can see none of the inputs have circles around them because we've spent all our inputs for plats, but anything that could be used for the outputs is now mapped. And if we go into the knob sets, into jacks, you'll see the mappings of all the jacks dance around. And if we go into our knob sets, then we can navigate between knob sets by either pressing this button here or just holding this button and moving back and forth. So this lets us control plats, this lets us control marbles, and we can easily navigate back and forth between the two. So that's nice, but the modules aren't talking to each other. Let's take a look at building a patch from scratch. Let's make a simple patch using a few modules. Now there's no way to search for module types or see what a module does other than sort of squint onto the screen here. It would be nice, I think, if they added text and let you zoom into these modules. But for now, at least, it's better to familiarize yourself with what each module does on VCV Rack. Let's choose a few modules. I'll take Bogue Audio's LFO from here. And I'll use that both as a random CV generator and as clock to patch into a quantizer mother from Orange Line. And let's patch that into, let's say, plats, why not? And then spice things up with topographic delay from 4MS. I won't make this in quad, but I would. You can just load 2 of them and easily make a quad patch. And I thought I would avoid it, but why should we? Let's add plateau reverb from Valley. So we added the modules, but we didn't really patch them to each other yet. Let's do that now. Take the square source, use that as a clock, a new cable, not a panel cable. We want to make a cable inside MetaModule and patch that to trigger or clock mother. Then go back here, choose the random source, stepped source, again, new cable, patch that into the CV input of mother. Then go to mother's outputs, all the way down here. Where are you at? Here we go, CV. Patch that, a new cable into plats volt per octave. Then go for mother's gate output. Here we go, gate, and use that to strum plats. I might fast forward through this because I think you get the idea, but grab the output of plats, plug that into topographic delay to the input, audio input, grab tapo delays outputs, and patch that into valleys left. And I could go the other way around, by the way. I could go from the input back to the output. And then finally, plug plateaus, outputs, here we go, left to the panel, right? To the out one, thank you for doing that for me. And then patch is already added. New panel cable, out 2. Our patch is already in motion, and we can go ahead now and play around with it. Say, for example, change the frequency here, slower clock, or change the CV scale on the output, maybe reduce that a bit so that we get a more moderate range of notes and maybe a few rests here and there because of voltage levels. I won't use Automap here because I don't want to make a mess of things. So let's say go to harmonics and then map that to knob set 1, wiggle the knob, and then I need to approve this. Now it's mapped to, where are you at? Knob set 1. Here we go. So that's how you make a manual mapping. And if I had a MIDI controller connected here, by the way, then I could also map, say, timbre to an external MIDI controller. You can also map buttons. So, for example, the pitched model, I can press this encoder to swap a model. And let's map this to knob set 2 as well. Hang on, where are we at? Let's wiggle this knob and approve it. And now I'll need to sort of turn it here, and then turn it back here, like this, to swap models. Until the button expander comes along, I guess. Once you've created a mapping, by the way, you can adjust the minimum and maximum ranges and even rename it if you like. Some modules have hidden or shift parameters. It's up to the module maker in here to expose those. So for example, Platts, as you may know, has these two additional parameters which are shift functions on the module. There's no way to shift function here. So it's up to whoever ported this module to implement that. So that's how you access the hidden decay. And we're not hearing the typographic delay yet because we need to activate one of its presets. Let's just go ahead and say press this. Pretty cool. We could use, of course, with maybe slightly less reverb. So we can always reduce that. And that is pretty much how you patch within MetaModule. You can always stop a patch if things get too generative for you. Let's see what else we have here. You can use the I menu to rename the patch and add a description. These are our knob sets. This is how you add modules. This is how you save the patch. And then we've got a few settings in here. You can choose whether you want to see the control maps on the panel and see the cables and their opacity. And then when you're in a module, you've got the wrench menu, which will also let you randomize a module or delete it. Let's move on and take a look at a few system settings. This menu has 5 tabs. The first will show you how out of date this video is. And if you have the Wi-Fi expander, you'll also see the IP address of the module. This is where you point your browser to transfer patches over here. Next is the plugins tab. Plugins are all the modules that don't come built into the hardware. All these are available for download on 4MS's website. So if we go back into the patch and add a module, then you'll see all the ones in the beginning are ones that are built into MetaModule without loading anything. And then anything beyond this point are plugins, meaning additional modules you can load through the SD card or the USB jack. If you don't get the Wi-Fi expander, choose which of these you want to use to transfer patches. I chose USB initially, so all the plugins are on the SD card. Anyway, back to the settings menu. Once you scan the disks, these will appear. And you can choose to either auto-load these when you start up the module or load them manually. Auto-loading modules doesn't take up any CPU. It just makes the startup time a little longer. And it doesn't seem like I've run out of space here, so I just chose to auto-load all the modules. If you don't auto-load these, then they won't appear in the plus menu when you want to add modules to your patch. So that's plugins. Preferences now lets you set the sample rate of the module and the block size. Sample rate can be either 96 or 24 kilohertz, alongside the default 48, of course, and block size, the default is 64. It can be 32 all the way up to 512. Block size impacts latency, and sample rate impacts the CPU usage much more than block size. Quite literally, it halves the CPU usage or doubles it. So let's go to our patch and hit play. So this is where we're at 48 kilohertz, and we're at 66% CPU. If I go into settings, preferences, and change the sample rate to 24 kilohertz, hit apply, it'll pitch down, but my CPU usage has gone down to 34%. So I could adjust pitches now, or hopefully they'll come up with some magic way that the pitch doesn't adjust. Things just get a little bit more lo-fi, but changing the sample rate is a great way to save on CPU. I don't know why you'd want to move to 96 kilohertz, but this patch probably won't run if I do. Yeah, it exceeds the CPU, so no point in doing that. Let's try and get it back up again. Cool. So that's sample rate. The block size, like I mentioned, doesn't impact CPU too much, maybe a bit. Latency at a block size of 64 I tested is actually 4 milliseconds. I tried going down to 32 and latency went down to 2 milliseconds, which is pretty much what you'd get on a standalone digital module like Rings. But I'm told by 4MS that going down to 32 might spike CPU usage on some modules. So unless low latency is super important to you, stick to 64. And this is as good a time as any to talk about the CPU usage. because there's not much else going on here in this menu. Anyway, the way the module is currently set up, if I open up a new patch and don't load any modules, CPU usage is at about 6%. Now here's the thing, I'm going to add the most power-hungry module I found so far, which is the 4MS ensemble oscillator. And as expected, my CPU usage jumped up to 31%. Now that may seem like a lot, and it is, but things aren't as bad because this number represents the CPU usage of the busiest core between two cores. So if I go ahead and bravely add another ensemble oscillator, and you can see our CPU usage jumped by only 2% because the other 25% is going to the second core. And I guess 2% more is some kind of overhead. Let's boldly add another ensemble oscillator. So that's another 22 or 23 to one of the cores. And if I add another ensemble oscillator, then it shouldn't change much because we'll only be, yeah, it didn't change at all. We'll only be filling in the second core. So now we've got 4 ensemble oscillators. So bottom line, while a single ensemble oscillator takes about 22 or 25% of a single core, it actually only uses half that of the total available CPU power. So only about 11, 12, or 13%. Right now, the only way to figure this out is just trial and error. Hopefully at some point 4MS add some sort of little CPU meter next to each module so we get an idea of how much CPU a particular module uses. For example, Bifaco's Rampage uses quite a bit. If you need just an envelope or LFO, then you might find a less CPU intensive module than this to do it. Okay, so that's it for patching on MetaModule itself. One of its most powerful features is the fact that you can also create patches on VCV Rack and then export those patches to MetaModule. That said, there are a few limitations you'll have to keep in mind when patching on your computer. First, make sure you're only using modules that are supported within MetaModule. There's no easy way to do that unless maybe you open another user and load up just those modules into that account on VCV Rack. If you have a better idea, let us know in the description. Otherwise, just right-click, choose the brand that you're familiar with that supports MetaModule, and then choose one of those modules, bring that into your patch. So say if I want to build a patch that's similar to the one that I built previously on MetaModule, let's grab Bogue Audio's LFO. Some VCV modules are supported here as well, so let's maybe grab their quantizer. We'll use that instead of Mother. Plats, of course, is easy. And then, of course, how could we not use Plateau? We can, of course, choose a scale, quickly recreate our patch more or less. Let's go into tempo, into valley, and out to our interface. Change maybe the scale a bit. Okay, good enough. Let's get typographic delay going too. Maybe not as wet. Not as wet here. And let's fine tune this a bit. Okay. Let's lower this. So we've got our patch, but that's not good enough. I don't want to be manually mapping it here, so let's add the MetaModule. And the first thing we'll want to do is connect the panel to the outputs. This audio interface module doesn't exist on MetaModule, so it'll just disappear when I load the patch into here. Now we could just finish here, but let's maybe map rate over here and map maybe harmonics into here and map this knob to control temper and map this knob to control morph. You can set ranges here as well, by the way. So if I right click this, I can set the range and also rename this. So let's call this tempo, for example. Let's also map time into typographic delay, and you can map more than one parameter. So let's say map this both to the decay of plateau and to the dry wet control. You can see two little dots here, and if I right click it, you can see that I can edit the ranges of what this controls as well. So we could give this patch a name, And last but not least, I need to save it not in VCV, but rather save it as a YML file. Now, if you don't have the Wi-Fi expander, you'll need to save it to a USB drive. MetaModule comes with this, and if yours doesn't, then these are pretty cheap. You can plug this into your computer if it's got this kind of port, save it here, then plug it into here and load the patch into MetaModule. Since I've got the fancy pants Wi-Fi expander, I could go ahead and choose where I want to load the patch into. Let's load it onto the SD card, hit upload, choose the patch, and it should be here. Let's go to load a patch, internal drive, look for, you know what you need to do here. Let's load it up. You can see the patch is here. Let's check out our knob sets, jack mappings. Let's hit play. Works pretty nicely. Let's see if our macros work. Remember, I renamed this one to a more patch-appropriate tempo label. Let's check our dual parameter valley plateau control. Works as expected. By the way, if a macro controls 2 parameters, you can see that over here. Okay, let's take a look at a few more things you need to keep in mind as you patch on VCV Rack. This is a polyphonic Platts patch I created earlier. So first, as of this firmware, MetaModule doesn't support polyphonic cables. So you've got to create as many modules as you want voices, and you need to use the split module to split out MIDI signals into each of the voices manually and then mix the voices together in a mixer. Which brings me to another important point I had to discover the hard way here. Apparently VCV has unlimited headroom, but MetaModule doesn't. So if you're mixing signals together, you need to make sure that on a per module basis, levels don't go above, oh, there we go, levels don't go above 10 volts in total. Otherwise, you'll get distortion going out or into the module. These modules are only supported in VCV Rack, by the way. They won't appear if you try to patch them into here. Same goes for these modules. You can use them in your patches, but you can't load them up in here. MIDI mapping parameters here, at least as of this firmware, is limited just to MIDI CCs. A few more things to note if you're building on VCV Rack. Test frequently as you build your patch, both to make sure you're not getting close to the CPU limits and to make sure that the audio isn't distorting because of the headroom issue I mentioned earlier. Also, you might find out that there are differences between modules in VCV versus MetaModule. I found a few discrepancies, most of which 4MS fixed, but I only tested a handful of modules, so other differences may be lurking. For example, while you can choose scales in marbles as a, where are you at, marbles? As a quote-unquote hidden or bottom of the list parameter. So that works here. You can't do that in the mother by orange line. Presumably they'll add that. Also in Bogue Audio's FM operator, I found that there's some distortion in the attack portion of the sound. Hopefully that'll be fixed soon. Also, for example, I found out that while there are plenty of Bifaco modules here, Mux Slicer, which is a very cool module, isn't included here, at least not yet. Hopefully they add that. So don't assume all the modules by a given manufacturer are here just because the manufacturer is here. And then one more important thing, you can't send patches you make here to VCV Rack, at least not in the current firmware. So once a patch is here, don't get all excited and make new macro mappings or add new modules. You won't be able to transfer those changes to VCV Rack. Okay, let's talk about pros and cons for MetaModule from 4MS. One reason you'd get this is if you wanted to use one or more virtual modules of the hundreds that are available in here and integrate that module into a larger Eurorack patch, whether it's not much larger or in a bigger case, of course. There are still plenty of modules in here that you probably don't have. So MetaModule is a great way to bring in plenty of new variety into your setup. And then a second reason to get MetaModule is if you wanted to create your own mini synth or mini audio multi-effect, regardless of any additional Eurorack gear. Anything from, like I mentioned, a quadraphonic tappographic delay to your own custom drone synth. There are pretty much no limits except the CPU here. But this isn't the only portable / small multi-module solution in town. Potential competition is a computer with a MIDI controller and VCV Rack, with or without a CV-capable audio interface or module like ES8 or ES9. Another alternative could be the iOS app MyRack, again with or without an audio interface and physical controller. And then a third option could be a module called Hector from Polyeffects. It's not based on VCV Rack, you can't create patches on your computer with it, but it has dozens of module types, a large touchscreen, multiple inputs and outputs, though no physical controls besides the touchscreen, and it includes ports of several mutable instrument modules. So in light of all that, pros for MetaModule are its compact size, its build which feels excellent, the 12 knobs, big or small, on the panel, the fact that it has plenty of inputs and outputs, and the fact that even at launch, it already has hundreds of available modules from multiple brands, including some pretty interesting and expensive ones from 4MS, with hopefully more to come both from them and from other brands. Another important pro for MetaModule, which helps overcome the con, which is its small screen, is that you can develop patches on VCV Rack and transfer them over here. Then on the cons side, there are two major limitations you need to be aware of. First, that making a patch on MetaModule itself, a patch that includes more than maybe just 3 or 4 modules, does not spark joy. It's doable, but much easier on a computer using VCV Rack. The screen is pretty small on its own. It's hard to read what's going on the modules. If you're not familiar with them, this isn't very usable. And even if you are, it still requires quite a few clicks to select a parameter, adjust it, turn the knob. For example, setting a scale on the quantizer, certainly compared to how easy it was to do it on a computer. Then the second important thing to consider is the limited CPU. I already discussed this earlier. If you're used to creating mega patches on VCV Rack and just grabbing any module you want and putting it on screen, here it's different. You'll need to be mindful of which modules you use and their overall CPU requirements. You also might encounter headroom limits like I discussed earlier that you won't on VCV, and there might be feature discrepancies between modules in VCV and modules over here. Another important thing to consider is bugs. I found quite a few issues here while testing this module, many of which 4MX quickly fixed, but there's no way that I can come close to testing everything in here. With so many moving parts, there are bound to be bugs lurking. Be aware of that if you're a brave early adopter. Then as far as things that it would be great to see in firmware updates, while I highly recommend discovering what modules can do on a computer, it would be nice still to be able to search in here and see text previews of what the modules do. Other things beside what I already wished for throughout this video, you can't currently patch 2 cables into a single input. That's a new feature in VCV Rack, and it might save you on a mixer module here. You also can't move modules around once they're in a patch, so it would be nice to be able to rearrange a patch. And you can't use MetaModule as an audio interface, which would be a nice option to have as long as you have it around the house and are patching with VCV Rack. Beside that, it would also be nice to have a 36 kilohertz option besides 48 and 24, seeing as how impactful this is on CPU usage. In summary, where MetaModule shines is for people who want to quickly integrate one of its hundreds of modules in their setup, or for someone who wants to build a dream standalone synth, effect, or module. Sure, you can do that with Max, Pure Data, or C++, but I think patching with VCV is the easiest and most approachable way to do it. So as long as you're able to contain your vision within its CPU limits, MetaModule I think is the easiest way to make your own portable little synth or effect. And if you'd like to get dozens of VCV and Eurorack patching ideas and tips, check out my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks, available to the people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.
you.